I used to believe that buying the perfect, staggeringly expensive vacation would finally make my family treat me like a relative rather than a walking wallet. Instead, on the morning of our flight, I walked into the living room to find a stranger's suitcase sitting exactly where mine belonged. My parents called it a minor change. My sister insisted it was a family duty. They forgot one crucial detail. That entire luxury trip was locked under my name alone. My name is Ariana James. I am 32 years old, and I thrive on order. As an operations strategy manager for Marrow and Vail Compliance Group in Chicago, my entire professional life revolves around identifying risks, establishing protocols, and ensuring flawless execution. I am the person people call when a system is broken and needs fixing. I am reliable. I am the bedrock. And for the past 6 months, I had applied that exact same rigorous planning to curating the perfect family vacation. It was supposed to be a masterpiece of a getaway. A 7-day luxury cruise sailing out of Miami, complete with a sprawling 4-person suite, a penthouse hotel reservation for the night before we boarded, private black car transfers, premium spa packages, and exclusive VIP shore excursions. I had paid for every single cent of it. I had meticulously researched, booked, and confirmed every detail to ensure that for one solid week, my parents and my younger sister would experience absolute, unadulterated luxury. I wanted to give them the world, or at least a highly manicured, perfectly scheduled slice of it, in the naive hope that buying a flawless experience might finally buy me a seat at the center of my own family. The morning of our flight was a brisk, sharp Chicago morning. I pulled my car into the driveway of my childhood home, the engine humming softly as I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was exhausted but thrumming with an electric kind of anticipation. I had my premium leather weekender bag, my meticulously organized travel binder, and a heart full of desperate optimism. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the entryway, expecting the usual frantic energy of a family trying to get out the door for an airport run. Instead, the house was thick with an unnatural, heavy quiet. I walked into the living room and stopped dead in my tracks. My younger sister, Sloane James, was sitting on the plush velvet sofa. Beside her, sitting far too comfortably, was her relatively new boyfriend, Cade Mercer. That in itself was odd, considering the sun had barely risen, but what truly anchored my feet to the hardwood floor was the sight by the front door. Lined up perfectly next to my parents' rolling suitcases and Sloane's designer trunks was a scuffed olive green canvas duffel bag. It certainly did not belong to anyone in my bloodline. I looked from the duffel bag to Sloane, then to Cade, and finally to my mother, Valerie, who was hovering near the kitchen island with a tight, strained smile plastered across her face. "Good morning, sweetheart," my mother said. Her voice was an octave higher than usual, dripping with that artificial sweetness she always deployed right before she asked me to sacrifice something. "You are right on time." I did not return the greeting. My eyes flicked over to the armchair by the fireplace, where my father, Graham, sat rigidly. He was intently studying a spot on the rug, going out of his way to avoid looking anywhere near my face. "Whose bag is that?" I asked. My voice was calm, a stark contrast to the sudden, icy dread blooming in my chest. My mother took a small step forward, clasping her hands together. "Well, Ariana, we were just talking about that. There has been a minor change of plans." "A minor change," I repeated. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten. "Our flight leaves in 3 hours. What minor change?" Sloane sighed dramatically, shifting on the sofa to lean closer to Cade. She rested her hand on his knee, a blatant display of unity. "Look, Ariana, do not make a big deal out of this. Cade is going to come with us on the cruise instead of you." The words hung in the air, absurd and suffocating. For a fraction of a second, my brain refused to process the sentence. It simply did not compute. I had paid for the trip. I had planned the trip. The reservations were under my name. "Instead of me," I stated flatly, "it was not a question." "It just makes more sense," Sloane continued, her tone entirely devoid of guilt. She spoke as if she were explaining a basic math problem to a slow child. This trip is very important for Kate and me. We are at a crucial stage in our relationship, and we really need this time together to bond with Mom and Dad. You are so mature and busy with your corporate life. You are constantly working anyway. You do not really need all these romantic sunsets and couples massages. You would probably just be on your laptop the whole time. I stared at her. I looked at her perfectly styled hair, her innocent, wide eyes that had been weaponized against me since we were children. Then I looked at Cade. He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, shifting his weight and staring at the floor, but he did not speak up. He did not say he could not possibly accept a luxury vacation paid for by the woman he was replacing. He just sat there, a willing participant in the theft. My gaze snapped back to my mother. "You agreed to this?" Valerie rushed to smooth the waters, her hands fluttering nervously. "Oh, honey, try to understand. Sloane has been having such a hard time lately, and Cade makes her so happy. It is just a wonderful opportunity for them. You have your beautiful apartment, your amazing job. You are so strong. Ariana, you can go on a trip like this anytime you want." "I bought this trip," I said, my voice dropping lower, the corporate manager in me taking over the emotional daughter. "I paid for the flights. I paid for the suite. I paid for the penthouse in Miami. I paid for the shore excursions. Every single dime came out of my bank account. And we appreciate your generosity so much," my father finally mumbled, still refusing to meet my eyes. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the thick leather envelope where we always kept our family travel documents. "We will find a way to make it up to you, Ari, we promise." I watched his hands. My father opened the envelope, supposedly to check the contents. Inside, I saw 3 familiar navy blue passports. Next to them was a black passport cover, Cade's passport. They had already swapped the documents. They had already packed his bags. Then, I saw it, resting on the glass coffee table. Completely isolated from the leather envelope was my boarding pass and my printed cruise itinerary. It sat there like discarded trash. A spare part that was no longer required for the machine to function. The sheer audacity of it washed over me, cold and clarifying. They had not called me the night before to ask. They had not even had the courage to pitch this to me as a request. They had held a family meeting without me, discussed the logistics, agreed to literally replace me on my own vacation, and then waited for me to walk through the front door so they could ambush me. They were banking on my lifelong habit of keeping the peace. They expected me to swallow the humiliation, hand over the keys to my kingdom, and drive myself back to my empty apartment while they flew to Miami on my dime. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It was not the familiar, heavy ache of being overlooked. It was not the sting of tears threatening to spill. It was an absolute, crystalline stillness. The suppressed emotions that had governed my entire life suddenly hardened into something unbreakable. "You planned all of this," I said. "It was a last-minute realization," my mother lied smoothly. "We just thought, since you are always so giving and understanding, that you would want your sister to be happy." "Stop," I commanded. The single word cracked like a whip through the living room. Valerie closed her mouth instantly. Sloane blinked in surprise. My father finally looked up, his eyes wide with apprehension. I did not yell. I did not throw my weekender bag against the wall. I did not cry. Crying would imply that they had hurt me, and right now, I was far beyond hurt. I was operating in a realm of pure, cold logic. I looked at the 3 people who were supposed to be my family, and the stranger who was eagerly stepping over my invisible corpse to get a free ride to the Bahamas. "You did not ask me," I said, my tone entirely conversational, yet freezing cold. "You made a unilateral decision to remove me from a trip that I funded in its entirety. Ariana, do not be so dramatic," Sloane scoffed, rolling her eyes. "It is just a vacation. You are acting like we are stealing your identity." I held my sister's gaze until she physically squirmed under the weight of it. Then I looked at my parents, who were watching me with bated breath, waiting for the moment I would inevitably cave. sigh, and tell them to have a good time. That was the script we had followed for 32 years. But the script had just burned to ashes. I turned my body toward the front door. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder. I did not reach for the itinerary on the table. I did not demand the money back right then and there. I looked back at them one final time and delivered a sentence so devoid of warmth it felt like breathing winter air. If you all have decided this trip does not need me, then try going without me. I did not wait for a response. I did not wait for my mother's gasp, or my sister's inevitable complaint about my attitude, or my father's weak attempt to call me back. I turned the handle of the front door, walked out into the brisk Chicago morning, and pulled the door firmly shut behind me. The roles in the James household were assigned early and carved into solid stone. I was the concrete foundation. My sister was the stained glass window. Everyone loves to stand back and admire how the sunlight catches the glass, marveling at the vibrant colors and the delicate, fragile beauty of it. Nobody pays attention to the gray, heavy concrete buried in the dirt, silently bearing the weight of the entire structure to keep it from collapsing. From the time I was 14 years old, I was the designated reliable child. I brought home flawless report cards, not because I was hungry for praise, but because excellence was the baseline expectation for me. While my parents spent their weekends soothing Sloan over a mediocre grade on a history quiz or a dramatic falling out with a middle school friend, I was in my room, quietly figuring out how to apply for early college credits. By the time I turned 18, I was working 30 hours a week at a local bakery to cover the textbooks and living expenses that my partial academic scholarship did not include. When I graduated at 22, I moved into a tiny, drafty apartment on the north side of the city. I paid my first and last months of rent, along with a hefty security deposit, using the tip money I had hoarded in a shoebox under my bed. I never asked my parents for a dime. I never gave them a single reason to worry, to lose sleep, or to intervene. In hindsight, my flawless independence was my first and most fatal mistake. Sloan, conversely, was my parents' perpetual, lifelong emotional project. 2 years younger than me, she treated adult life like a tasting menu where someone else always picked up the exorbitant check. She dropped out of her university communications program after 3 semesters because the professors were, according to her, stifling her creative aura and demanding too much structured thinking. Then came the online boutique phase. For a solid year and a half, our parents' garage was stuffed to the ceiling with unsold, overpriced woven baskets and cheap imported jewelry that she swore would be the next bohemian trend. When that business inevitably collapsed under the weight of her terrible inventory management, burying her in severe credit card debt, my parents quietly liquidated a portion of their retirement savings to wipe her slate clean. After that disaster, she pivoted seamlessly to being a lifestyle content creator. She spent her days filming her morning matcha routines and unboxing complimentary PR packages, all while living in a trendy downtown loft that my father had enthusiastically co-signed and heavily subsidized. The financial disparity was glaring, but the emotional drain was what truly hollowed me out from the inside. I vividly remember the end of my first full year working in corporate strategy. I had worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificed every major holiday, and successfully navigated a brutal compliance audit for one of our biggest clients. As a reward, the firm handed me a bonus check that felt like an absolute fortune to a 23-year-old entry-level manager. I was overwhelmingly proud. I drove straight to my parents' house, eager to share the news, foolishly hoping for a rare, uninterrupted moment of parental pride. Instead, I walked into a domestic crisis. Sloan was weeping dramatically at the kitchen island because she had found the perfect apartment with a skyline view, but she was drastically short on the required deposit and the first month of rent. My mother pulled me aside into the narrow hallway near the pantry. She had that soft, pleading, meticulously crafted look in her eyes. She whispered about how incredibly stressed my sister was, how this specific apartment with its natural light was exactly what Sloan needed for her fragile mental health and her new aesthetic brand. Then, she gently asked if I could temporarily lend my sister $3,500 out of my brand new bonus. She squeezed my hand and assured me it was merely a bridge loan. Sloan would absolutely pay me back within 90 days. I transferred the money that same afternoon, swallowing my own pride to play the hero. 5 years later, I have yet to see a single penny of that money returned. If I ever dared to bring it up, my mother would accuse me of being petty, of keeping score, and of trying to ruin a nice family dinner over ancient history. The blatant erasure of my achievements only grew more pronounced over time. When I turned 28, I earned a massive promotion to management. It was a huge leap up the corporate ladder, a validation of years of relentless grinding. To celebrate, my parents invited me to a high-end Italian restaurant downtown. I bought a beautiful new silk dress. I spent 40 minutes carefully doing my hair and makeup. I genuinely thought, for one night, we would raise a glass to my hard work and my success. We were barely halfway through the expensive antipasto platter when Sloan burst through the heavy restaurant doors, 20 minutes late, waving her phone frantically in the air. She loudly announced to the entire table that a tiny, unknown boutique organic skincare brand had agreed to send her 3 free moisturizers in exchange for a few posts on her social media page. The entire gravity of the dining table shifted instantly, violently pulling away from me and locking onto her. My father immediately flagged down the waiter and ordered a $200 bottle of champagne to toast her brilliant entrepreneurial spirit. My mother spent the next 2 hours intensely questioning Sloan about ring lighting, target demographics, and the brand's packaging aesthetics. My promotion, the sole reason we were sitting at that candlelit table in the first place, was reduced to a passing, obligatory nod before the dessert menus even arrived. I sat there slowly chewing my pasta, feeling the familiar suffocating sensation of becoming entirely invisible in my own life. Whenever I attempted to set a boundary, whenever I dared to express even a fraction of the deep, accumulating hurt I felt, the response was always a variation of the same toxic script. My mother would place a warm, patronizing hand on my arm, look at me with exasperating pity, and tell me that I was the stronger one. She would explain that I was so incredibly independent, so capable, and so thick-skinned that yielding to my sister a little bit would not fundamentally harm me. My father preferred a much more clinical, detached approach. He liked to call it family balance. He continuously argued that since I was doing so exceptionally well in life, I had the ample emotional and financial bandwidth to absorb the constant turbulence that Sloan brought into our orbit. But I knew it was not balance. It was the absolute cowardice of path of least resistance parenting. They routinely sacrificed the peace of the child who did not cause a scene in order to appease the child who would gladly burn the entire house down if she did not get her exact way. Slowly, methodically, and relentlessly, I was boxed into the role of the family utility knife. I was the ultimate problem solver. I was the one who always paid the bills on time and kept my credit score pristine. I was the reliable, stoic emergency contact. I was the person they called in a panic when a car broke down on the highway, when a confusing apartment lease needed reviewing, or when someone needed a highly sensible piece of advice that they were ultimately going to completely ignore. I was deemed absolutely essential when there was heavy lifting to be done, when a mess needed cleaning, or when a check needed writing. Yet, I was conveniently and consistently forgotten the moment it was time for the joy, the celebrations, and the rewards to be divided. The suffocating weight of that realization had been pressing down on my chest for over a decade. It was a quiet, grinding, daily agony that I had learned to dress up in tailored corporate suits and bury deeply under endless spreadsheets and operational strategies. But deep down, far beneath the stoic, hardened professional exterior, the neglected daughter inside of me was still desperately starving for a permanent seat at the table. That pathetic, lingering, irrational hope was the exact foundation upon which I had built the entire luxury cruise plan. I had reasoned, with flawed logic, that they could not possibly ignore me or push me to the side if I was the sole architect of the entire breathtaking experience. If my hard-earned money, my meticulous planning, and my flawless execution were the only reasons they were drinking premium champagne on a private balcony in the middle of the ocean, they would finally have to see me. They would have to look at me, acknowledge my worth, and treat me as an equal part of the family rather than a highly functional accessory. I genuinely believed that by throwing an overwhelming amount of undeniable luxury at them, I could finally buy my way out of the blurry background and step into the warm spotlight of my own family dynamic. I thought that if I tightly controlled the narrative and the purse strings from the very beginning, I could not physically be pushed out of the frame. It was the most expensive, desperate, and heartbreakingly foolish delusion of my entire life. The third quarter of the fiscal year had been an absolute, unmitigated bloodbath. For 3 solid months, I practically lived inside the glass walls of my corner office at the firm, surviving on lukewarm black coffee, stale protein bars, and maybe 4 hours of broken sleep a night. I spearheaded a corporate restructuring project that saved our largest client tens of millions of dollars. The physical and mental toll was profound. My shoulders permanently ached, and my eyes were constantly bloodshot. But when the performance bonuses were finally distributed in late October, the figure deposited into my checking account was staggering. It was not just a bonus. It was the kind of wealth that could instantly serve as a substantial down payment on a very beautiful house in a quiet, leafy suburb. Instead of investing it or locking it away in a high-yield savings account like a responsible strategist, I looked at those numbers on my screen and saw something entirely different. I saw a life raft. I saw a golden, irrefutable ticket to finally fix my fractured family. I decided right then that I was going to engineer a memory so monumentally perfect, so overwhelmingly generous, that it would permanently rewrite our dynamic. I did not just want to book a standard vacation. I wanted to orchestrate a cinematic masterpiece of a getaway. My research was exhaustive, leading me to the Astor Crown. It was not one of those massive, floating amusement parks packed with screaming children and crowded buffet lines. It was a vessel renowned for its uncompromising exclusivity and hushed, elegant atmosphere. I bypassed all the standard staterooms, the ocean view cabins, and the entry-level balconies. Instead, I secured the aft corner owner's suite. It was a sanctuary of absolute opulence, boasting over 1,000 square feet of pristine living space. The architectural renderings showed floor-to-ceiling windows framing endless ocean views, a master bathroom clad entirely in imported white marble with a soaking tub, and a wraparound teak balcony large enough to comfortably host a private cocktail party. The booking included a dedicated, white-gloved butler available 24 hours a day to unpack our bags, press our clothes, and serve us freshly brewed espresso every morning. I even arranged for a private dining experience to be set up exclusively for the 4 of us on our balcony under the stars, completely away from the other passengers. The itinerary itself was meticulously mapped out over 7 glorious days. We would depart from the glittering, sun-drenched port of Miami, sailing first toward the crystalline turquoise waters of Nassau. There, I had bypassed the crowded public beaches and reserved a private oceanfront cabana with a dedicated attendant. From the Bahamas, we would sail onward to the lush, mountainous coast of St. Thomas, where a privately chartered catamaran would take us snorkeling in secluded coves. The return leg of the journey was designed purely for physical and emotional indulgence. It featured a completely uninterrupted day at sea dedicated entirely to a comprehensive, full-body spa retreat. I booked hot stone massages, deeply hydrating facials, and private thermal suite passes for all of us. The entire voyage was scheduled to culminate in a grand captain's gala night on the final evening. I envisioned us dressed in our absolute best, my father in a sharp tuxedo, my mother and sister in elegant evening gowns, and me standing proudly beside them. I wanted us sipping vintage champagne, looking exactly like the perfect, unified, deeply connected family I had spent my entire life pretending we were. To ensure the illusion of perfection began the very second we landed in Florida. I wanted to eliminate the standard stress of a chaotic travel day. I knew exactly how my family operated under pressure. Minor inconveniences usually triggered major arguments. To prevent this, I secured a breathtaking penthouse suite at a five-star hotel overlooking South Beach for the night before our embarkation. There would be no frantic, sweaty rushing from the airport baggage claim directly to the crowded cruise terminal. There would be no snapping at each other in the back of a cramped, poorly air-conditioned taxi. I booked a private, luxury black car service to meet us right at the arrivals gate. I wanted our transition from Chicago to the ocean to be seamless, velvet-lined, and entirely stress-free. Because my professional brain thrives on risk mitigation, I approached the logistics of this trip with the same ruthless precision I applied to my corporate compliance audits. High-end cruise lines do not play loose with their manifests or their security protocols. I spent hours reading the microscopic print of the terms and conditions. I learned that passenger names had to be definitively locked in the system a strict 48 hours prior to departure. No exceptions, no last-minute substitutions at the dock. I memorized the clause stating that the primary guest, the sole individual holding the reservation, absolutely had to be physically present at the port for the initial check-in process to release the boarding passes. Most importantly, the primary credit card placed on file for all onboard incidentals, gratuities, and room charges had to perfectly match the government-issued identification of the suite's primary occupant. I ensured that every single confirmation number, every digital ticket, every exorbitant deposit for our shore excursions, and every exclusive dining reservation was anchored firmly to one specific identity. The entire architectural framework of this luxury experience belonged exclusively to Ariana James. In my heart, I knew I was not simply buying a change of scenery. I was attempting to purchase a cure for a terminal disease I had never been permitted to name out loud. The systemic, deeply ingrained favoritism that had defined my entire existence. I foolishly thought that if I immersed my parents and my sister in an environment where every ounce of joy, every sip of expensive wine, and every breathtaking sunset was directly provided by my hand, the old toxic dynamics would physically not be able to survive the trip. They would be forced to look at me differently. They would no longer be able to see me as just the reliable workhorse, the stoic problem solver, or the emergency bank account. They would have to see me as the generous benefactor, the beloved daughter, the cherished, invaluable older sister. I was using my hard-earned wealth to try and buy my own intrinsic value within my own bloodline. Once everything was finalized, I compiled the entire itinerary, down to the last transfer confirmation, into a beautiful, thick leather presentation portfolio. I had the cover elegantly embossed with our family name in gold foil. On a crisp Sunday afternoon in early November, I drove to my parents' house to deliver the surprise. They were sitting in the living room, my father reading a magazine and my mother scrolling through her tablet, while Sloane lounged on the rug. I handed the heavy portfolio to my mother and asked her to open it. I stood there, holding my breath, watching their eyes widen as they slowly flipped through the thick, cream-colored pages detailing the owner's suite, the private transfers, the spa day, and the endless, paid-for amenities. My mother gasped loudly, dropping the portfolio onto her lap and covering her mouth with both trembling hands. My father actually put down his magazine entirely, taking off his reading glasses and looking up at me with a mixture of profound shock and deep respect. Sloane scrambled up from the floor, throwing her arms tightly around my neck, squealing at the top of her lungs about the incredible photo opportunities and how absolutely amazing I was. For about 15 glorious, intoxicating minutes, the air in that familiar living room was completely transformed. My mother pulled me into a fierce embrace, her eyes shining with what looked like genuine tears. My father clapped me on the shoulder, his voice thick with pride. They showered me with praise, telling me how incredibly generous, successful, and thoughtful I was. In that fleeting golden sliver of time, the heavy, suffocating concrete block that had rested on my chest for over a decade completely dissolved. I felt entirely visible. I felt validated. I felt, for the very first time in my 32 years of life, like I truly, undeniably belonged to them. That bright, burning hope was the most dangerous thing I had ever felt, and it would ultimately make the betrayal hurt infinitely worse. The euphoria of that Sunday afternoon lasted exactly 72 hours. By Wednesday, the atmosphere in our family group chat had subtly shifted. It was no longer about gratitude. It had mutated into a bizarre, hyper-focused logistical interrogation. I am a corporate operations manager. I make my entire living reading the spaces between the lines, identifying subtle anomalies in data sets, and predicting structural failures long before they actually happen. My professional instincts were practically screaming at me, but I deliberately chose to reach over and mute the alarm. It started with Sloane. Her text messages were no longer about how excited she was for the shore excursions or the thermal spa menu. Instead, she began asking highly specific, deeply unusual questions about the ship's architectural layout. She wanted to know the exact dimensions of the grand staircase leading down to the main atrium. She texted me late at night to ask if I knew exactly what time the sun would set on the third evening, and whether the ambient lighting on the upper observation deck was harsh fluorescent or a softer, warmer, golden tone. One afternoon, she called me while I was in the middle of a brutal quarterly budget review to ask if the ship's string quartet could be bribed or formally requested to play a custom piece of music during the captain's gala night. I laughed it off at the time. I naturally assumed she was just planning an elaborate, highly choreographed video aesthetic for her social media followers. I told her the crew was likely very accommodating to VIP suite guests, but that she should not expect a private, customized concert. She just hummed thoughtfully into the receiver and hung up without another word. 2 days later, my mother called. We were casually discussing the formal dress code for the specialty dining restaurants when she suddenly cleared her throat. Her voice took on that overly casual, artificially breezy tone she always used when she was testing the temperature of the water before dropping a heavy stone. She asked me, purely hypothetically, she heavily stressed, if the cruise line allowed for passenger name changes close to the actual departure date. I paused, my hand hovering completely still over my laptop keyboard. I asked her why on earth we would ever need to change a passenger name. She stammered slightly, claiming she was just suddenly worried about my father's chronic inner ear issues. She rambled about reading an article online regarding severe seasickness and wondered aloud what would happen if someone physically could not board the vessel at the very last minute. It made absolutely zero logical sense. If my father could not go, the suite would simply have 3 occupants instead of 4. You do not just substitute a blood relative with a random understudy like a community theater production. I firmly reminded her of the strict maritime security policies I had already explained in detail, reiterating that the manifest locked down tight 48 hours before we set sail. She went quiet for a very long, heavy moment, then quickly changed the subject to the humidity forecast in southern Florida. The most glaring red flag came from the man who historically avoided travel logistics entirely. My father texted me late one evening to ask about the private black car service I had booked to take us from the Penthouse Hotel to the Miami Port Terminal. He wanted to know the exact make and model of the vehicle. When I told him it was a premium luxury extended SUV, he specifically asked exactly how many seatbelts were in the back rows. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, utterly baffled. I replied that there was more than enough room for 4 adults and all of our heavy luggage. He responded with a thumbs-up emoji, followed by a casual remark about how it is always better to have an extra seat just in case we need more breathing room. Just in case. The phrase rattled around in my skull like a loose bearing. There were exactly 4 of us. The math was entirely immutable. Who exactly needed the extra breathing room? Simultaneously, another anomaly began to aggressively infiltrate our daily family dynamic. Cade Mercer. He had only been dating my sister for about 4 months, yet suddenly, his name was a constant, inescapable echo in every single conversation. My mother casually mentioned how much Cade loved fresh seafood when we discussed the ship's dining menus. My father brought up Cade's strong preference for warm weather when we talked about the Bahamas itinerary. It was as if this man, whom I had only briefly met twice over, rushed, awkward cups of coffee, had been seamlessly integrated into our family's collective consciousness. He was a phantom 5th passenger, constantly hovering over a reservation built strictly for 4. The undeniable climax of these warnings occurred exactly 12 days before our scheduled flight. I had left the office a few hours early and decided to drop by my parents' house to deliver the waterproof luggage tags I had specially ordered. The front door was unlocked, so I walked right in. I heard soft acoustic music coming from the guest bedroom upstairs, a space which Sloane frequently commandeered as her secondary dressing room. I walked up the carpeted stairs and paused in the open doorway. Sloane was standing in front of the full-length floor mirror. She was not trying on a breezy tropical sundress or a standard elegant evening gown. She was wearing a breathtaking, creamy white, floor-length dress constructed of incredibly delicate silk and intricate lace. It clung to her perfectly, sweeping the floor with a subtle train. It was not a dress you wear to a nice family dinner. It was a dress you wear when you expect to be the absolute center of attention in a very specific, highly photographed, life-altering moment. She caught my reflection in the mirror and gasped loudly, spinning around. A flash of genuine, raw panic crossed her face before she swiftly masked it with her trademark bright, careless smile. She smoothed the white silk down her thighs and innocently asked me how it looked. The air in the room felt suddenly very thin and incredibly cold. I stepped inside, my eyes locked on the white lace. I kept my voice perfectly level, carefully masking the sudden, heavy dread pooling in the pit of my stomach. I gently reminded her that the owner's suite and the exclusive dinner reservations were strictly arranged for the four of us, exactly as we had discussed in the original, beautifully printed plan. I told her it was going to be an intimate family trip, quietly implying that such an extravagant, distinctly bridal-looking gown might be severely out of place for a dinner with her parents and her older sister. Sloane did not blink. She did not argue. She just looked at me through the reflection of the glass, a strange, triumphant little smirk playing on the corners of her lips. She reached behind her back to slowly unzip the dress and casually said that in this day and age, anything can be changed if you want it enough. I should have known right then. Every single alarm bell in my highly trained, deeply analytical brain was absolutely deafening. The bizarre questions about the stage lighting, the hypothetical late-stage name changes, the extra seatbelt in the luxury car, the constant hovering shadow of Cade Mercer, and the creamy white silk dress. It was a complete puzzle with all the jagged pieces laid out right in front of my face. The data was utterly conclusive, but I committed the ultimate sin of a corporate strategist. I deliberately ignored the data. I chose to actively suppress my own intuition. I sat in my car in their driveway afterward, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and aggressively rationalized every single red flag away. I told myself Sloane was simply being her usual, overly dramatic self, caught up in the glamorous fantasy of dressing up for a gala. I convinced myself my parents were just anxious, inexperienced luxury travelers overthinking the minor logistics. I refused to assemble the pieces because the resulting picture was far too grotesque for my heart to comprehend. I was clinging so desperately to the warm, intoxicating memory of them praising me, of finally feeling like I was a valued entity, that I willingly blindfolded myself. I did not want to ruin the fragile, incredibly rare feeling of pure anticipation I had nurtured for months. I wanted to be the beloved daughter so badly that I let them build the entire path to my downfall right beneath my feet. That blind, pathetic, desperate hope was my true undoing. It was the exact reason why the knife in my back on the morning of our flight did not just cut me, it completely eviscerated me. My hand was gripping the cold brass doorknob when the sheer weight of my sister's audacity finally shattered the quiet room. I had intended to simply walk away, to leave them drowning in the immediate aftermath of my ultimatum, but Sloane could never abide someone else having the final word. She needed to be the righteous party, the victim, the protagonist of every single room she occupied. "Ariana, wait," she called out, her voice pitching into that whiny, victimized register she had perfected in grade school. "You are not seeing the bigger picture here. You are making this all about you. As usual, Cade is not just coming along to get a tan. He is planning to do something really special." I stopped. I did not turn around immediately. I stood facing the heavy wooden door. processing the phrasing. Something special. I turned my head slowly, my eyes locking onto the two of them. Cade shifted his weight on the sofa, his face flushing a deep, uncomfortable shade of crimson. He reached up and rubbed the back of his neck, looking anywhere but at me. A rare opportunity for true love, my mother chimed in from the kitchen. Her hands clasped tightly against her chest, as if she were witnessing a pivotal scene from a daytime soap opera. When Cade came to us last week and asked for our blessing, we were just so overwhelmed with joy. We realized the ship, the formal nights, the beautiful private balcony you booked. It is the absolute perfect setting for him to pop the question. My father nodded enthusiastically, finally mustering the courage to look at my face. Exactly. Ari, this is about your sister's future. You are a highly successful woman. You make a fantastic living. You can book another trip for yourself anytime, to anywhere in the world. But a proposal? A monumental moment like this? It only happens once in a lifetime. The sheer volume of the disrespect was almost a physical entity in the room, pressing against my lungs. They had not just swapped a passenger out of convenience. They had actively hijacked my meticulously funded, carefully curated vacation to serve as a glamorous, zero-cost backdrop for someone else's love story. If you really, truly love me, Sloane continued, her tone shifting seamlessly from defensive to sickeningly sweet, you will look at this as your engagement gift to us. Think about how amazing the photos will be on the water. Think about how much this beautiful gesture means to the family. And we are not leaving you completely empty-handed, my father added hastily, stepping forward with his hands raised, playing the role of the reasonable mediator. We will tally up your portion of the travel expenses. We fully intend to pay you back for your share of the room and your plane ticket later. Once things settle down and the wedding planning begins, my share, my portion. They spoke as if my presence on this voyage was merely a fractional commodity, a single cheap seat on a crowded commuter bus that could be easily refunded with petty cash. They conveniently ignored the fact that the entire reservation, the thousands of dollars in non-refundable deposits, the penthouse, the private cars, the shore excursions, all of it belonged entirely to me. I was not a passenger splitting a bill. I was the sole sponsor of the entire expedition. I let go of the doorknob. My feet moved mechanically, carrying me back away from the entryway and toward the glass coffee table where my discarded boarding pass lay like a piece of refuse. Beside it sat the beautiful custom leather-bound presentation portfolio I had gifted them weeks ago. It was lying slightly open. I looked down at the thick, cream-colored pages. My father had flipped to the section detailing the captain's gala dinner on the final night. There, written in my mother's distinct, loopy handwriting right next to the reservation time for our private balcony meal, were 5 words circled heavily in bright red ink. Best moment for proposal. I stared at the red ink until the letters began to blur. It was not a sudden epiphany on their part. It was a calculated, thoroughly premeditated theft. I really want to thank you, Ariana, Cade suddenly blurted out, shattering the tense silence. His voice was thick with nervous gratitude and forced camaraderie. He stood up from the sofa, taking a tentative step toward me. I know how much work you put into organizing everything. Valerie and Graham told me you actually hate being stuck on cruise ships anyway, and that you proactively offered to give up your spot so Sloane and I could have some romantic space to ourselves. I promise I will take amazing care of her. It is incredibly generous of you to step aside like this. The room went completely, terrifyingly still. The air grew so thick it was hard to breathe. I looked at Cade. His earnest, somewhat dim-witted expression confirmed everything. He was not a malicious co-conspirator. He was a pawn. My parents and my sister had blatantly lied to him. They had constructed an elaborate, completely fictional narrative where I was the benevolent, self-sacrificing older sister who cheerfully surrendered my own luxury vacation just to facilitate his grand romantic gesture. They had fed him this lie so he would not feel a single ounce of guilt about packing his bags and stepping directly over me to take my spot. I shifted my gaze to my mother. The artificial warmth had completely drained from her face, leaving her pale and rigid. Her perfectly manicured hands were shaking against the kitchen counter. My father suddenly found the floorboards incredibly interesting again. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Sloane's confident, triumphant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a tight, panicked grimace as she realized her boyfriend had just completely exposed their web of lies. They had planned this for days, perhaps even weeks. The whispered conversations in the kitchen when they thought I was not listening, the hushed phone calls, the secret fitting of the white silk dress I had stumbled upon. They had all been collaborating, carefully writing me out of my own life, spending my hard-earned money in their heads, and laughing at my expense while securing a free ride for a man I barely knew. In that exact, crystallizing second, the last remaining thread of my lifelong loyalty snapped. It did not merely fray, it severed cleanly, leaving behind nothing but cold, absolute clarity. I was entirely untethered from them. Any normal person would have screamed until their throat bled. They would have flipped the heavy glass table, torn the leather itinerary to shreds, and demanded the authorities be called for financial fraud. But I am not a normal person. I am a strategist. Screaming is a catastrophic loss of control. Screaming signals to the opposition that they have successfully inflicted emotional damage. I absolutely refuse to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I refuse to let them see me bleed. I looked at Cade, offering him a single, brief nod, acknowledging his absolute ignorance in this betrayal. Then, I let my gaze sweep over the three people who shared my last name. I memorized the fear in their eyes. An engagement gift, I repeated. My voice was completely devoid of any recognizable human emotion. It was a flat, dead, metallic sound. I understand completely. I reached down, picked up my heavy leather weekender bag from the floor, and adjusted the strap over my shoulder. I did not take the leather portfolio. I did not take my printed boarding pass. I simply turned around and walked away from the table. As I crossed the threshold of the front door, I heard my mother exhale a massive, trembling sigh of relief behind me. I heard Sloane excitedly whisper something to Cade about grabbing their carry-on bags. They actually believed they had won. They genuinely thought my silence was an act of surrender, that I had dutifully swallowed the poison and agreed to clean up their mess just like I had done for the past 3 decades. I stepped out into the crisp, freezing Chicago air and pulled the door firmly shut behind me until I heard the heavy brass lock click into place. I walked to my car in absolute silence. I left them to their ignorant, foolish relief. Let them pack the trunk. Let them drive to the airport. Let them toast to their brilliant, flawless deception. They had absolutely no idea that the moment that front door closed, the spectacular, luxurious trip they were so eager to steal ceased to exist entirely. I did not merge onto the congested highway heading toward the international airport. I drove in the exact opposite direction. I gripped the leather steering wheel with steady hands, navigating the familiar, sprawling suburban streets until I reached the massive, desolate parking lot of a high-end outdoor shopping mall that would not open for another 3 hours. I bypassed the main entrances and steered my car into the furthest, most isolated corner of the lot, parking beneath a flickering street lamp. I shifted the gear into park, killed the engine, and let the profound, heavy silence of the cabin wash over me. There was no music playing. I was not crying. My hands were not shaking. The chaotic, suffocating energy that had consumed my parents' living room felt entirely far away, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp focus. I unzipped my weekender bag, pulled out my laptop, and rested it evenly across the steering wheel. I connected to my mobile hotspot. I opened my email inbox, took a single, deep breath of the cold morning air, and began the systematic demolition of my own empire. My first target was the cruise line. I dialed the elite, dedicated customer service number for the Astor Crown. A cheerful, highly professional representative named Julian answered the call on the second ring. I verified my identity, provided my booking reference number, and calmly instructed him to cancel the owner's suite in its entirety. Julian paused, the bright customer service cadence completely vanishing from his voice. He stammered slightly, warning me that at this incredibly late stage, Literally hours before the scheduled embarkation, the maritime cancellation penalty was an absolute, non-negotiable 100%. He informed me that I would forfeit every single dollar of the massive deposit and the final payment. The financial loss would be astronomical. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of any hesitation, and told him that I understood the terms completely and authorized the immediate cancellation. Then, Julian hesitated again. He cleared his throat and mentioned that there was an active, highly sensitive internal note attached to my file. He asked if I also needed to cancel the surprise coordination package flagged for the captain's gala on the final night. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I asked him, in a voice that could cut through solid steel, to explain exactly what that package entailed. Julian, clearly sensing the sudden drop in temperature, nervously read the logs. He explained that a woman identifying herself as my mother had contacted the ship's private concierge desk 2 days prior. She had explicitly stated that she had the primary guest's full permission and financial authorization to organize a romantic, highly photographed event. She had successfully reserved a secluded section of the upper observation deck, pre-ordered 3 bottles of premium vintage champagne, and placed a standby photographer on my personal onboard tab. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the violation hit me like a physical blow. They had not only planned to steal my trip, they had actively impersonated my authority. They had weaponized my name to squeeze even more free labor, luxury, and dedicated service out of a reservation they were violently pushing me out of. I instructed Julian to wipe the entire slate perfectly clean. I told him there would be no suite, no gala package, no champagne, and absolutely no boarding passes issued under that reservation number. I told him to burn it all down to the digital ground. He processed the request swiftly, and within 2 minutes, the crown jewel of my family's stolen vacation evaporated into the ether. A confirmation email pinged in my inbox, finalizing the death of the reservation. I did not stop there. The momentum of the purge felt incredible. I moved with the ruthless, mechanical efficiency of a corporate liquidator dismantling a deeply corrupt and bankrupt firm. I opened the confirmation portal for the luxury penthouse hotel in Miami. I clicked the cancellation link without a single flinch. A red warning text popped up, advising me that I would lose the entire first night's room rate due to the short notice. I clicked confirm. They would have no sweeping, panoramic ocean views to wake up to tomorrow morning. I pulled up the reservation for the private black car service that was supposed to meet them at the arrivals gate. Cancelled. I imagined them standing on the sweltering, chaotic curb at the Miami airport with their heavy designer luggage, completely bewildered, fighting thousands of other frantic tourists for a standard yellow taxi. I logged into the cruise line's separate shore excursion portal. I systematically and methodically refunded the private beach cabana in Nassau. I canceled the luxury catamaran charter in St. Thomas. I erased every single hot stone massage, every deeply hydrating facial, and every thermal suite pass I had so carefully curated for our day at sea. I canceled the private balcony dining experience. Every single comfort, every ounce of privilege, every beautiful aesthetic moment I had financed, I meticulously stripped away. Next was the airline. I logged into my frequent flyer account. Because my parents and my sister were so incredibly eager to secure their stolen spots, they had enthusiastically checked in online the night before. Their tickets were strictly locked in the airline system, completely ineligible for any sort of refund, cancellation, or modification. They were absolutely going to fly to Florida. But my first-class ticket, the one sitting untouched on the glass coffee table back in Chicago, was still open and unassigned. With 3 quick clicks, I converted my seat into a travel credit for my own future use. Let them take the flight. Let them land in a humid, crowded city where they had absolutely nothing waiting for them. The final, most crucial step of the operation remained: my platinum credit card. This was the specific card linked directly to the cruise line's onboard spending account. It was the card meant to seamlessly cover every poolside cocktail, every specialty coffee, every late-night room service order, and evidently, a professional photographer. I opened my secure banking application on my phone. I navigated deeply into the security and fraud settings. I found the specific card profile and firmly tapped the toggle switch that read, Lock Card. The screen flashed a bright, solid green, confirming the total freeze. The financial blood supply was completely and permanently severed. They could not charge a single dime to my name. If they somehow managed to talk their way past the port security, if they somehow thought they could just swipe a card and fix the mess, they would be met with a cold, hard decline. I had built the entire castle, and now I had pulled the primary linchpin, letting the walls collapse right on top of them. I closed my laptop. The screen went black. I checked the digital clock on my dashboard. The entire process, from the moment I parked the car to the moment the green confirmation flashed on my phone, had taken exactly 15 minutes. 15 minutes to systematically dismantle months of exhausting planning and sever ties with tens of thousands of dollars. I leaned back against the leather headrest and stared out at the empty gray parking lot. I sat there in the silence, waiting for the inevitable crash. I waited for the heavy, crushing grief to hit my chest. I waited for the terrifying realization that my family dynamic was truly, irreparably broken, that a massive amount of my hard-earned money was gone forever, and that my grand, foolish dream of finally buying their respect and love was officially dead and buried. But the tears never came. I did not feel sad. I did not feel angry. I did not even feel a sense of vindictive, triumphant joy. Instead, a strange, overwhelming, an absolute wave of peace washed over my entire body. It was the deepest, most profound sense of relief I had ever experienced in my 32 years of life. I realized, sitting alone in that quiet car, that I had not just canceled a luxury vacation. I had finally stopped performing. I had officially stopped paying the exorbitant ransom for a familial love that was never going to be given to me freely. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried since childhood, the constant need to prove my worth through financial utility and silent obedience, was completely gone. I felt incredibly light, exactly like a person who had finally gathered the strength to reach back and cut the thick, heavy rope that had been slowly dragging them into a merciless, bone-crushing meat grinder for 3 decades. The machine was still running, but I was no longer trapped inside it. I drove back to my apartment, brewed a fresh cup of Earl Grey tea, and simply waited. The first few hours were predictably quiet. Because their boarding passes for the outbound flight were already issued and completely separate from my cruise portal, they breezed through airport security in Chicago without a single hiccup. They likely ordered expensive drinks at the departure gate, completely convinced that my dramatic exit was just a temporary tantrum. In their minds, I was sitting at home, cooling off, destined to eventually apologize for ruining the morning mood. They fully believed the safety net was still firmly in place because I had never, not once in my entire life, actually let them hit the concrete. The first crack in their impenetrable delusion appeared at exactly 1:30 in the afternoon. My phone screen lit up on the kitchen island. It was a text message from Sloan. "Where's the driver? We are at baggage claim and nobody is holding a sign. Did you book it under the wrong name again?" I did not reply. I took a slow sip of my tea. 10 minutes later, another text vibrated against the marble. "Seriously, this is not funny. It is 90 degrees out here and Kate is sweating through his shirt. Fix this. By 2:15. My mother called." I watched her contact photo flash on the screen until the call seamlessly rolled over to voicemail. Shortly after, a frantic, poorly punctuated text arrived from her number. "The hotel is telling us the penthouse is canceled. They say you called this morning. There must be a system error. Please call the front desk right now. They are being incredibly rude and refusing to let us leave our bags." I pictured the scene vividly. They had to drag their massive, heavy designer suitcases back out onto the sweltering Miami curb. I imagined the 4 of them, dressed in their carefully planned resort wear, aggressively shoving their luggage into the cramped trunk of a standard, distinctly unglamorous yellow taxi. They were likely sweating, snapping at each other, and demanding the driver take them directly to the cruise terminal. They foolishly assumed that if they just bypassed the hotel and went straight to the ship, they could argue their way into the owner's suite and sort out the glitch in person. The true magnitude of the disaster struck them at approximately 3:45. The barrage of incoming communication shifted abruptly from annoyed entitlement to absolute, unhinged panic. My phone began vibrating violently, a relentless rhythm of digital desperation. 7 missed calls from my mother, 4 from my sister, 3 from my father. I poured myself a glass of crisp white wine, sat on my velvet sofa, and finally tapped the voicemail icon. My father's voice boomed through the speaker, no longer playing the quiet, diplomatic mediator. Listen to me very carefully. We are standing at the elite check-in desk. The port agent is telling us the owner's suite has been completely voided. They are saying you personally authorized a total cancellation this morning. Furthermore, they will not even let Cade pass the security gate because his name is not anywhere on the manifest. You need to call this port authority right this second, give them your platinum card, and reinstate the booking. This childish temper tantrum stops right now. Call me back immediately. Then came the text messages from Sloan. The realization that the money and the glamour were actually gone had stripped away her sweet, victimized facade, revealing the pure venom underneath. You vindictive, jealous monster. You are literally ruining my life. You could not stand the fact that someone actually loves me enough to propose. Could you? You are so bitter and alone that you had to destroy my one special moment. You owe us thousands of dollars for this flight. I hate you. Then came the secondary wave of realization. A text from my mother. Her tone completely shattered, devoid of her usual patronizing warmth. They are saying the private dining is gone. The spa packages are gone. The cabana is gone. Everything is gone. Where are we supposed to sleep tonight? Please, Ariana, just pick up the phone. We are standing in the middle of the terminal and people are staring at us. The entire ecosystem of luxury I had built had evaporated, leaving them completely stranded in an expensive city during peak tourist season. At exactly 5 o'clock, an unknown number appeared on my screen with a Southern Florida area code. For a reason I still cannot fully articulate, I swiped to answer it. It was Cade. The background noise on his end was utterly chaotic, filled with echoing terminal announcements and the muffled, shrill sounds of Sloan aggressively yelling at a maritime customer service representative. He did not sound angry. He sounded profoundly exhausted and completely shell-shocked. "I am not calling to yell at you," he said quietly, his voice slightly breathless, as if he were actively walking away from the screaming match. "I just had a very long talk with the ticketing agent. She showed me the original booking history. It was just the 4 of you. There was never a 5th ticket. There was never a formal name transfer requested until this morning, and the system automatically denied it." He paused, letting out a heavy, ragged breath over the receiver. "They lied to me. They told me you absolutely hated the ocean and begged me to take your place so they would not lose the expensive deposit. You never agreed to any of this, did you?" I took a sip of my wine, staring out at the Chicago skyline. "No, Cade, I did not." He let out a low, bitter curse. "I am so sorry. I am booking a separate flight back to Chicago tonight." He hung up before I could say another word. The reality of a Saturday night in Miami finally crushed my family a few hours later. The city was concurrently hosting a massive music festival and a major corporate convention. Every decent hotel, resort, and boutique inn was completely booked solid. Through a final, desperate, and remarkably subdued text from my mother, I learned their ultimate fate. They had been forced to drag their expensive luggage to a dingy, 2-star motel located directly beneath the airport flight path, paying an exorbitant, price-gouged rate of nearly $500 just to have a single, cramped room to sleep in. The sun set, casting a warm, golden glow across my quiet living room. I looked at my phone resting on the coffee table. The notifications were still rolling in, a desperate, pathetic stream of demands, insults, and manufactured crises. I picked up the device and opened my settings. I blocked my father's number. I blocked my mother's number. I blocked my sister's number. I methodically went through my contacts and blocked my cousins, my aunts, and anyone else who might eventually be recruited to harass me in the days to come. I set the phone face down. For the first time in my entire existence, the apartment was completely, beautifully silent. There were no financial fires to extinguish, no fragile egos to meticulously soothe, and no unspoken demands hovering in the air. I breathed in the absolute stillness, waiting for the familiar, heavy wave of guilt that usually followed any act of self-preservation. It never arrived. By Tuesday afternoon, the extended family gossip network was operating at maximum capacity. My cousin Tessa was the first to break the absolute quarantine I had imposed. She called my secure office line, completely bypassing the block I had placed on my personal cell phone. She sounded incredibly hesitant, tiptoeing around the issue for several minutes, before finally admitting what my parents were actively telling everyone. According to Graham and Valerie James, I had suffered a massive, completely unprovoked mental breakdown. Their carefully crafted, deeply sympathetic narrative claimed that I simply could not handle the fact that my younger sister had found true love before me. In a fit of bitter, lonely rage, I had spitefully canceled the entire family vacation at the literal last minute, leaving them stranded in southern Florida with broken hearts and empty wallets. My initial instinct was to simply hang up the phone and let them spin their desperate web. I was entirely too exhausted to fight a coordinated smear campaign, but then Tessa sent an image directly to my work email. It was a screenshot of a draft from Sloane's private, secondary social media account. The image featured a close-up of my sister's hand resting against that creamy white silk dress, a massive, sparkling diamond ring emoji pasted perfectly over her ring finger, accompanied by a caption written in a looping, elegant font. It read, "She said yes, the most perfect night of my life, floating on the ocean." I stared at the digital timestamp located at the very top of the screenshot. It had been created and saved exactly 5 days before our scheduled departure. The proposal was not some spontaneous, romantic whim that Kate had suddenly brought to my parents in a moment of passion. It was prepackaged, heavily premeditated social media content. My sister had been drafting her digital victory lap almost a full week before I even walked into that living room. That single screenshot flipped a heavy switch in my brain. I stopped avoiding the wreckage and started actively digging through it. I opened my personal email and navigated to the deleted folder, searching for the final, automated cancellation receipts from the Astor Crown. I found a massive system dump from the cruise line's customer service department, detailing the complete chronological communication history attached to my specific reservation number. I began reading from the bottom up, slowly tracing the digital footprints of their betrayal. The first glaring anomaly was an email sent 4 days prior to our flight. The sender name was listed as Valerie James, but she had used my primary booking reference number to bypass the security firewall. She had written to the ship's private concierge desk with a highly unusual logistical question. She politely explained that her daughter, the primary guest and sole account holder, had encountered a sudden corporate emergency and might be delayed by 24 hours. My mother then boldly asked if a high-resolution, colored scan of my passport and a photocopy of my platinum credit card would be legally sufficient for the rest of the family to board the ship, access the owner's suite, and begin utilizing the onboard amenities in my physical absence. The sheer, calculated criminality of the request made my blood run entirely cold. They were not just planning to casually swap a passenger, they were actively conspiring to forge my presence. They wanted the maritime authorities to accept a piece of paper so they could unlock the heavy suite doors I had paid for, effectively turning me into a ghost bankroller. The second email in the chain was infinitely more damning. It was sent from Sloane's email address, directly coordinating with the special events team for the captain's gala. She meticulously requested a specific brand of vintage champagne, outlined the exact ambient lighting she wanted on the upper observation deck at sunset, and confirmed the booking of the ship's premium photographer. But it was the final sentence of her message that hit me with the force of a swinging pendulum. "Please ensure the private table setting and the photography framing are arranged strictly for 3 people. Sloan had written, "My sister, who is the primary account holder, will absolutely not be participating in this portion of the evening. We want the space entirely to ourselves." I sat perfectly still in my leather office chair, the harsh glow of the monitor illuminating the absolute truth. I had initially believed that their ultimate crime was ambushing me on the morning of the flight to casually give my paid ticket to Cade. But this digital paper trail revealed a much darker, far more parasitic reality. Even in their original, undisturbed plan, the one where I actually got on the airplane and sailed to the Bahamas with them, they had fully intended to lock me out. They were going to smile at me, eat the expensive dinners I bought, sleep in the luxurious beds I provided, and then, on the most spectacular, most expensive night of the entire voyage, they were going to politely ask me to make myself scarce. They had planned to physically remove me from the very pinnacle of the experience I had built, just so they could play the role of the perfect, wealthy family without my inconvenient, depressing presence ruining the aesthetic. As I sat there processing the absolute magnitude of their manipulation, a notification chimed on my personal laptop. It was a direct message on a professional networking site. The sender was Cade Mercer. It was a long, incredibly detailed, and deeply sobering message. He did not ask for forgiveness, nor did he attempt to defend his own foolishness. He simply laid out the exact sequence of events from his perspective, desperate to clear his own conscience. He explained that my parents and Sloan had approached him 2 weeks before the trip. They sat him down and fed him a beautiful, seamless lie. They told him I was drowning in severe corporate burnout, that I violently hated the claustrophobia of cruise ships, and that I was desperately looking for a noble excuse to back out without losing the massive deposit. They claimed I had come to them with a brilliant, generous idea. I wanted to quietly gift my spot to Cade, completely free of charge, so he could have the perfect, romantic backdrop to propose to my sister. Cade wrote that he had felt incredibly humbled and deeply grateful for my supposed generosity. He admitted he felt slightly awkward about not thanking me in person beforehand, but Sloan had heavily insisted I was way too stressed with work and preferred not to make a big deal out of the transfer. Then, he detailed exactly what happened at the port in Miami. When the elite ticketing agent flatly rejected his passport and explicitly stated that the booking was solely for 4 family members, that no legal name transfer had ever been requested until that very morning, and that the primary guest had aggressively canceled the entire reservation due to fraud, the grand illusion instantly shattered. Cade wrote that he stood in the sweltering terminal, looking at my parents frantically trying to bribe the port authority, and looking at Sloan aggressively screaming at a customer service worker, and he finally saw them for exactly who they were. He did not stay at that cheap airport motel with them. He told me he packed his canvas duffel bag, looked my sister dead in the eye, and ended the relationship right there on the concrete curb outside the cruise terminal. He booked the very next commercial flight back to Chicago, paying for it with his own money, completely abandoning them to the miserable, sweltering reality they had created for themselves. I read Cade's message 3 consecutive times. I printed it out, along with the screenshot from Tessa and the damning email thread from the cruise concierge. I carefully placed the warm, freshly printed pages into a clean manila folder. The profound, quiet peace I had felt in the parking lot days ago suddenly crystallized into something much sharper, much more dangerous. I was no longer just a wounded daughter quietly stepping away from a toxic environment. I was a corporate operations manager holding irrefutable, meticulously documented proof of systemic fraud and emotional manipulation. The stinging pain of the betrayal had entirely evaporated, replaced by the cold, heavy weight of absolute leverage. My family thought they could simply return to Chicago, spin a tragic tale of my sudden, inexplicable cruelty, and continue to comfortably thrive on the social sympathy of our relatives. They foolishly assumed my silence was a symptom of shame or defeat. They had absolutely no idea that I was not hiding from them at all. I was simply gathering my ammunition, building an airtight, impenetrable case. I now possessed the timeline, the digital receipts, the witness testimony, and the indisputable truth. And for the first time in 32 years, I was fully prepared to systematically burn their fabricated narrative straight to the ground. 14 days after the disastrous weekend in southern Florida, a new message bypassed my blocked numbers by arriving directly into my corporate email inbox. The sender was my father. The subject line was remarkably sterile, reading simply as a request for family resolution. I opened the message and read it with the detached, clinical eye of an auditor examining a fraudulent tax return. Graham did not open with an apology. He did not ask how I was doing. Instead, he crafted a masterclass in passive-aggressive deflection. He stated that since they had returned to Chicago and had time to recover from the shocking and highly stressful logistical nightmare I had caused, it was time for us to sit down like reasonable adults. He referred to their calculated theft as an unfortunate miscommunication regarding the travel itinerary. He gently suggested that we meet at my apartment on Tuesday evening so we could clear the air, forgive each other, and graciously move past my sudden, uncharacteristic outburst. The underlying tone was unmistakable. It was an executive order dressed up as an olive branch. He fully expected me to open my door, make them a pot of coffee, and dutifully accept my share of the blame so the comfortable family dynamic could immediately resume. I did not type out a furious paragraph. I did not aggressively defend my actions. I replied with exactly 2 sentences. I stated that I would not be hosting them in my home, but I would agree to a single conversation if it took place at Aunt Helen's house during the traditional family barbecue scheduled for the end of the month. My father replied within 10 minutes, quickly agreeing to the terms. He undoubtedly viewed the venue as a massive tactical advantage. He and my mother thrived in front of an audience. They knew I abhorred public scenes and strictly avoided making waves in front of the extended family. They assumed the presence of my aunts, uncles, and cousins would effectively force me to be polite, compliant, and quick to surrender. They thought I was walking right into their trap. They failed to realize I had chosen the battlefield specifically to trap them. I spent the next week transforming my dining room table into a war room. I was no longer operating as a grieving, rejected daughter. I was functioning as a prosecuting attorney preparing for a major tribunal. I bought a heavy professional-grade presentation binder and began compiling the physical evidence of my lifelong exploitation. I printed the cruise line's ironclad terms and conditions, highlighting the maritime security clauses in bright yellow. I printed the itemized financial receipts proving every single cent of the trip had originated from my personal bank accounts. I printed the damning correspondence from the ship's concierge, the digital trail of my mother attempting to forge my presence, and the text messages detailing my sister's explicit instructions to exclude me from the most pivotal evening of the voyage. But that was merely the evidence for the immediate crime. If I was going to sever this toxic limb, I needed to expose the entire infected root system. I logged into my banking archives, pulling transaction records dating back an entire decade. I created a comprehensive, meticulously formatted spreadsheet. I documented the massive bridge loan I gave Sloan for her apartment deposit 5 years ago, the one that was never returned. I listed the emergency mechanic bills I covered when her car inexplicably broke down. I cataloged the numerous times my parents had asked me to quietly cover a month of their mortgage or a high utility bill because they had overextended themselves bailing out my sister's failed online boutique. I tallied every single dollar I had bled for them under the guise of being the reliable child. The final sum printed at the bottom of the page was staggering enough to make my stomach physically turn. 2 days before the scheduled barbecue, my cousin Tessa called me again. Her voice was hushed and tight with anxiety. She warned me that my mother was actively engaged in a preemptive public relations campaign. Valerie had spent the entire week calling every single relative who would be attending the gathering. She was diligently laying the groundwork for my execution. According to Tessa, my mother was speaking in a trembling, deeply sympathetic tone on these phone calls. Valerie was telling everyone that the immense pressure of my recent corporate promotion had finally broken my mental health. She claimed I was suffering from severe emotional instability, that the demanding hours had made me paranoid and cruel. She framed the canceled vacation as a tragic, manic episode brought on by extreme burnout, and she begged the family to treat me with gentle, pitying patience when they saw me on Sunday afternoon. When Tessa relayed this information, a strange, metallic calm settled over my entire nervous system. It was the final validation I needed. If I had chosen to simply walk away without a word, if I had refused the meeting and maintained a dignified silence, my mother would have permanently rewritten our family history. She would have successfully cast herself and Sloane as the innocent victims of my sudden, tragic madness. My silence would be weaponized as proof of my guilt. They would sit around holiday tables for the next 20 years, shaking their heads sadly about poor, unstable Ariana. I could not allow that fiction to survive. I was not preparing this heavy binder to demand an apology. An apology is a tool used to repair a bridge and continue a relationship. I had absolutely zero interest in continuing the relationship. I was preparing this dossier to deliver a permanent eviction notice. I was officially terminating my lifelong role as their financial safety net and their emotional punching bag. The night before the family gathering, I lay completely still in my bed, staring up at the dark ceiling of my bedroom. The city traffic hummed quietly outside my window. I did not sleep for a single minute. My heart was not racing with fear, nor was my mind spinning with anxiety about the impending confrontation. I was wide awake because a profound, heavy grief had finally managed to catch up to me. It was not the grief of losing the lavish trip. The money and the luxury were entirely irrelevant now. It was the crushing realization that when the sun rose tomorrow, I would be walking into a house full of people I had known my entire life, fully aware that I was about to detonate the very foundation of our connection. Tomorrow was the day I would officially lose my family in the traditional, comforting sense of the word. But as the hours ticked by and the early morning light began to bleed through the blinds, an even deeper, sharper pain emerged. The true tragedy was not that they had betrayed me in Miami. The true tragedy was that I had willingly participated in my own erasure for so long. I had bought into the illusion that if I just worked harder, paid more, and caused less trouble, they would eventually love me the way they loved Sloane. I had sacrificed my own boundaries and heavily funded my own disrespect. The thing that hurt the absolute most in that quiet, that dark room was the undeniable truth that I had waited 32 years to finally stand up and protect myself. The atmosphere inside Aunt Helen's sprawling suburban home that Sunday afternoon was suffocating. The air smelled of roasted meat and heavy tension. When I walked through the front door, I counted roughly 20 relatives gathered in the main living room. The casual backyard barbecue had been explicitly entirely relocated indoors, transforming the space into a makeshift courtroom. Everyone was seated in a wide circle, their eyes locked on me the moment I crossed the threshold. My mother had clearly done her preliminary work. The collective gaze of my aunts, uncles, and cousins was thick with a cloying, patronizing pity. They had been thoroughly prepped to handle a mentally fragile, overworked woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I took the single empty armchair at the edge of the room. I set my heavy black presentation binder squarely on my lap. I did not offer any warm greetings. I simply folded my hands and waited for the prosecution to begin. My father, Graham, immediately took the floor. He stood near the stone fireplace, adopting the posture of a weary but noble patriarch forced to discipline a wayward child. He cleared his throat and launched into a meticulously rehearsed monologue. He accused me of deeply humiliating our family name and causing a massive, unnecessary public spectacle. He stated that I had maliciously destroyed my younger sister's romantic future over a simple, minor logistical misunderstanding that could have easily been resolved with a quick phone call. Valerie chimed in right on cue. She sat slumped on the leather sofa, dabbing at her completely dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. She sobbed theatrically, telling the room that she simply did not recognize her eldest daughter anymore. She claimed I had grown incredibly cold and corporate, that my demanding job had stripped away my empathy, and that I had selfishly turned a tiny change of plans into a catastrophic Greek tragedy. Sloane sat flanked by two of our younger cousins, her arms tightly crossed over her chest. She glared at me and loudly declared that I was nothing more than a bitter, lonely woman. She announced to the entire room that my cruel actions were completely rooted in jealousy, that I simply could not stomach the idea of watching someone else be happy and loved. I sat perfectly still. I listened to every single word. I let them exhaust their vocabulary of insults. I let them dig their fabricated grave as deep as they possibly could. I waited until their righteous anger began to taper off, until the room fell into a heavy, expectant silence, with every relative waiting for me to break down in tears and beg for their collective forgiveness. Instead, I calmly unclasped the metal rings of my binder. I pulled out the first stack of freshly printed documents and handed them to Aunt Helen, politely asking her to pass them around the circle. A confused murmur rippled through the room as the crisp papers exchanged hands. I watched my aunt pull her reading glasses down the bridge of her nose. I watched her eyes widen in absolute shock as she read the printed email correspondence between my mother and the private maritime concierge. The room grew deathly quiet as they all read Valerie's explicit, written request to use a scanned copy of my passport to fraudulently access my prepaid suite in my physical absence. Next, I produced the printed luxury itinerary. I held it up for the room to see, pointing directly to the captain's gala dinner schedule. There, written clearly in my mother's distinctive handwriting, was the bright red ink circling the time slot, labeled explicitly as the best moment for a proposal. I followed this immediately with the printed email from Sloane, the one where my sister issued strict instructions to the event staff, demanding that the table settings and the professional photography be arranged strictly for 3 people, because the woman paying for the entire voyage would absolutely not be permitted to attend. The patronizing pity in the room completely vanished, replaced by a stunned, horrified realization. The carefully constructed narrative of my mental instability was disintegrating right in front of their eyes. Then, Tessa stepped forward from the back of the room. She pulled her mobile phone from her pocket, her hands shaking slightly. She looked at Sloane, and then she read aloud a text message my sister had sent to a mutual friend nearly a full week before the trip was supposed to happen. Tessa's voice cut through the heavy air like a razor blade. "Do not worry about Ariana," Tessa read, quoting my sister word for word. "She will fall in line and be a good girl. She always paves the way for me." The color instantly drained from Sloane's face. Valerie's theatrical weeping stopped dead, her mouth hanging slightly open. Graham's authoritative, patriarchal posture collapsed entirely. He suddenly looked like a very small, very frightened man. But Sloane, ever desperate to maintain her victimhood, tried one final, panicked pivot. She pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed that regardless of the emails, I was still a monster. She cried that my vindictive cancellation was the sole reason Cade had abandoned her in Florida, and that I had permanently destroyed her one real chance at a beautiful marriage. I reached into the very back of my binder and pulled out the final piece of paper. It was the printed message from Cade Mercer. I did not hand this one out. I read it myself. I looked directly into my sister's panicked eyes and told the entire room the absolute, undeniable truth. I announced that Cade did not leave her because the luxury vacation was canceled. I revealed that Cade left her because, while standing in the sweltering Miami terminal, he finally discovered that she and my parents had spun an elaborate, malicious lie. They had told him that I hated the ocean and had enthusiastically agreed to step aside and fund his grand romantic gesture. Cade walked away, paying for his own flight home, because he realized he was about to propose to a manipulative fraud who was actively stealing from her own blood. The silence that blanketed Aunt Helen's living room was absolute and suffocating. The aunts and uncles who had looked at me with judgment just 20 minutes ago were now staring at my parents and my sister with unfiltered disgust. Graham stammered, his face flushing a deep, embarrassing shade of crimson. He took a weak, hesitant step toward the center of the room. He desperately tried to deploy his favorite, worn-out excuse, the one he had used to justify their behavior for my entire life. He mumbled that he was only trying to manage a difficult situation, that he just wanted to keep the peace in the household so everyone could be happy. I stood up from the armchair, the heavy binder snapped shut in my hands. I looked my father dead in the eye, and I delivered the single sentence that had been trapped, burning in my throat, for over a decade. "Your peace," I said, my voice steady, freezing cold, and echoing off the living room walls, "has always been built entirely on my silence." I did not raise my voice, but my tone left absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. I turned to face the entire room, making sure every single relative heard my new terms clearly. I announced that effective immediately, the financial and emotional safety net they had exploited for years was permanently destroyed. I declared that there would be no more emergency loans. There would be no more quietly paying rent when someone decided to quit a job. There would be no more covering massive credit card debts or rescuing anyone from the consequences of their own reckless actions. Furthermore, I stated that I would no longer be attending any shared family vacations, Thanksgiving dinners, or holiday gatherings. The absolute severing of my utility was complete. I told them this boundary would remain locked as a fortress wall until I received a profound, genuine apology and witnessed actual, sustained behavioral change. I knew, and looking at their terrified faces they knew as well, that such a day would likely never arrive. I picked up my purse, I turned my back on them and walked toward the front entryway. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody called my name. Nobody offered a single word of defense. I stepped out of Aunt Helen's house and out into the bright, crisp afternoon. As I walked down the driveway toward my car, I did not feel like a tragic outcast who had just been forcefully exiled from her home. I felt exactly like a prisoner who had finally realized the heavy iron door to her cage had been unlocked the entire time, and I had simply, finally, chosen to push it open and walk away. Several months later, the bitter Chicago winter began to thaw into spring. I sat at my quiet kitchen island, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and logged into my airline account. I looked at the massive travel credit sitting securely under my personal profile. I did not browse for large, multi-room family suites or crowded cruise itineraries. Instead, I booked a single, first-class ticket to a breathtaking, secluded luxury resort nestled deep in the lush mountains of St. Lucia. I reserved a private, cliffside villa featuring an infinity pool that overlooked the endless expanse of the ocean. The entire trip, from the private helicopter transfer to the exclusive daily spa retreats, was strictly designed and heavily guarded for one person alone. My name was the only one on the entire manifest. And this time, absolutely no one in the world could take my spot. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below with your city or country so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.